Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. The topic of our presentation is the question as to whether Rothbardian economics, that is, the current of the Austrian school, initiated in the United States by Mary Rothbard and developed by his successors such as Walter Block, Hans Hermann Hoppe, Jörg Guido Hülsmann, to name only a few, is value-free, the verdict being negative. To it, the main contention of ours is that Rothbardian Austrian economics presupposes in its basic conceptual framework the libertarian theory of justice. However, before we proceed further, we should like to add a crucial caveat, namely, our thesis is not a critique. First off, our research draws on the insights by contemporary meta-ethicists such as Hilary Putnam or Philippa Foot, who set forth plausible arguments to the effect that in human language there are concepts, so-called thick terms, that sort of transcend the famous fact-value dichotomy in that they are both descriptive and prescriptive, or evaluative, if you like. Just think of concepts such as rudeness as opposed to civility, or development as opposed to stagnation or retrogression, or courage as opposed to foolhardiness or bravado on the one hand, or cowardice on the other, or murder as opposed to, for instance, killing in self-defense. Those are those terms that are dubbed thick terms, that have double descriptive and evaluative meaning. Thus, we should also distinguish between two types of value-ladenness in social science. First, we have ideological value-ladenness, which is about all those things, all those bad things you might probably associate with value-ladenness in science. It is about research, falsification, dogmatism, dishonesty, scientific misconduct, and so on and so on. The latter, in turn, the conceptual type of value-ladenness, that is about there being thick terms in social sciences. And, at least in our opinion, there is nothing wrong about it, because such concepts shape the way we, as human beings, see and describe things. Just to give you a quick example, try to describe the Holocaust or Gulag without employing the thick term murder. Also, it is noteworthy that both Rothbard and his successors, for example, Hoppe or Bloch, as philosophers, subscribe to meta-ethical cognitivism. That is, a stance according to which moral statements are not a matter of taste, but rather genuine and truly fundamental knowledge. Thus, at least from their perspective, the presence of the ethical in economic science should present no greater a difficulty than the presence of, say, physics in the fundamentals of chemistry. Finally, Rothbardians and other Austrians as well have a good meta-scientific reason to abandon value freedom altogether. Value freedom or Wertfreiheit, if you like. Namely, as is known, Austrianism has always been at odds with the positivist empiricist ideal of a unified science based on naked, observable data. One of the reasons for that has always been the adherence to the thesis about the dependence of observable data upon theory, which is a claim shared by virtually all contemporary philosophers of science, by the way. And now, who says that in social sciences, the theory upon which our observations hinge cannot be a normative one?
Okay, thank you. So take over from here for the time being. So maybe first thing that would need here some additional explanation is whether our thesis that Rothbardian Austrian economics is value-laden or it's not value-free is obvious or it's not obvious. We actually sort of struggled with this question because in our experience it appeared to be obvious for some researchers and scholars, and for some scholars it appeared to be controversial. So that's one of quotes that we decided to use here to show that Rothbard himself subscribes, at least in some writings of his, to this idea that Austrian economics, in his version of Austrian economics, is value-free. Although maybe one more word would be here in order. It was sort of mentioned before by Norbert already that, of course, value freedom might be understood differently. We can point into two ways of understanding this idea. One would be sort of street-level understanding, I would say, which would be basically that a piece of theory is value-laden or it's not value-free when it recommends some way of acting or you recommend some policy or that is praising or blaming some sort of actions. In this sense, of course, it's obvious that Rothbardian Austrian economics is not value-laden, that it is value-free. But what we have in mind is actually more sophisticated concept, more philosophically advanced concept, which is that Rothbardian Austrian economics is value-laden in terms of its basic conceptual framework. Which would be this element of Rothbardian Austrian economics that would be value-laden? Well, we would suggest that one of basic concepts that would involve this sort of normativity would be basically the concept of free market. When we think about the free market, Rothbard understands free market as you can see here in this quote, as an array of all voluntary exchanges that take place in a society. But in turn, voluntary exchange then is understood by Rothbard in terms of rights. Rights that, of course, are just rights or juridical rights, as we would say, which are obviously normative concepts. Now, in what way voluntary exchange, which is the basis for free market and free market institutions for Rothbard, is value-laden, how it is dependent on rights. So I think that we can find at least three ways of three stages at which we see this dependence of the concept of voluntariness on a normative idea of just or juridical rights. So first of all, for an exchange to take place, as noticed by Rothbard, of course, parties to the exchange have to have goods or services that they exchange with one another, with each other. But for Rothbard, it's pretty obvious not any old having would do. So there is a very specific having that would figure in an exchange that Rothbard would then call voluntary exchange or free exchange. And this having, of course, has everything to do with the known theory of John Locke and appropriation of unowned resources via mixing labor. So as we can see here, our selection, by the way, our selection of quotes was on purpose made from Rothbard's economic treatise. So besides some exceptions, we decided to go for these quotes from Man, Economy and State, which is at least declaratively or should be a purely economic treatise. So I think it shows even stronger how the concept of free exchange or voluntary exchange and free market and so on and so forth, is dependent on these normative ideas. So first of all, as we can see, Rothbard, of course, presupposes lock-in idea of self-ownership as the starting point for the analysis of which sort of having would do for free exchange to take place, and then it switches into appropriating unowned resources. Now, maybe one point more, as you can see here, there might be a temptation to think that what Rothbard is really talking about is ownership in the economic sense. As we remember from Mises is using the word ownership in this value-neutral or normatively neutral way, economic ownership. From this quote, amongst other quotes, we can clearly see that this is not what Rothbard means, because if it really were economic ownership, that would be something that would resemble possession or detention of an object or use of an object. That would basically extinguish at the moment at which this possession terminates. Whereas for Rothbard, ownership might exist in perpetuity. So these rights are acquired in perpetuity, as this quote documents here. Then another thing that would be important here is that for Rothbard, what is the subject of exchange on the free market is not necessarily goods or services, but titles thereto. These titles, of course, are titles that are acquired originally in the ways I've just indicated, which is mixing labor and starting with the idea of self-ownership. And therefore that's the second layer at which we would say that the idea of voluntary exchange presupposes normative theory of justice, libertarian justice. Finally, probably the most important and most interesting element is the manner of exchange. So even if parties have these titles that they acquired via mixing labor and via being self-owners, not any manner of exchange would do for Rothbard, of course. There would be exchanges that would be made under pressure. Just maybe not to beg the question, there are different sorts of pressure that might be exerted on parties to exchange, and only some of them would render these exchanges involuntary. So, of course, the manner of exchange that would render this exchange involuntary would be an exchange made under coercive proposals or under coercive pressure. This pressure being, of course, a threat directed towards property rights. So not any old threat would do. The very good case why that wouldn't be the case is, of course, blackmail, which for Rothbard would involve coercion in this normative sense. So blackmail's proposal would render exchange voluntary. I guess my time is done here. The same would be with value, so we can just read that. Yeah.
Okay, I know that we are running short of time, so without further ado, let us briefly apply our analysis to the case study of three major areas of Rothbardian research. The comparative analysis of economic systems, theory of monopoly, and hopefully welfare economics. So, as for the comparative analysis, as you can see in those quotes from Rothbard and Hans Hermann Hoppe, both capitalism and the alternatives to it, that is interventionism and socialism, are defined against the Rothbardian moralized notions of voluntariness and freedom. The free market is free in Rothbard's specific sense of the term, and correspondingly, the alternatives are unfree in the very same sense. Now, note that it is not the case that what Rothbardians do is simply juxtaposing the free market, as is conceptualized in their moralized terms, with opposite approaches or systems. Rather, Rothbardians define those approaches or systems in their value-loaded terms as well. therefore, the normative entanglement is to be found throughout their comparative analysis, that is, in literally whatever they have to say, for that matter. Secondly, Rothbard's seminal theory of monopoly. Even though at first glance, the Rothbardian concept of monopoly doesn't seem particularly suspicious, so to say, value freedom-wise, the case raised by Rothbard in its favor does. As is known, Rothbard, for example, rejects the idea of monopoly as having control over the price. And along the same lines, he also rejects the idea of consumers' sovereignty, because on the free market, says Rothbard, prices are voluntarily agreed upon phenomena. Voluntarily agreed upon phenomena, and each and every individual is a self-sovereign. And it so happens that we already know what voluntary means to Rothbard. And now it seems pretty obvious that per Rothbard, governmental monopolists are true monopolists, since they violate the underlying property rights, whereas the alleged private ones do not. Do we still have time to talk about welfare economics?
Go ahead with monopoly.
Go ahead. So we have 1 minute if we skip this question.
Okay, but I've already finished this part. So shortly about welfare economics. As is known, Rothbard's welfare economics also hinges upon Rothbard's theory of voluntariness, Rothbard's highly moralized or rights-based theory of voluntariness. Therefore, long story short, Rothbard's welfare economics cannot but be value-loaded as well. That's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. Even I have a lot of questions by myself, but unfortunately we're running out of time. So for anyone who has questions, please ask Lukasz or Norbert after the session. I guess they will be eager to answer all of your doubts and questions.